Hello and welcome to a webinar from Being Better Than Before on how to learn from other people-driven industries. My name is Carl Nordgren. You're mostly going to be hearing today from Mark Tully as we share what we've learned about how other industries engage in effective recruitment. Just a little bit of background from me. I'm an entrepreneur. I've started a great range of companies. I've been an entrepreneur all throughout my adult life. I spent 14 years as a teacher. For 14 years, I taught courses in creativity and entrepreneurship at Duke University to the undergrads there at Duke University, nearly 60 courses. I love being in the classroom with students. Isn't that so exciting to be in the classroom with students? It was just a great period in my life. I learned so much from teaching. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working with a great range of individuals, helping them grow their creative and entrepreneurial qualities, including military leaders and entrepreneurs, working with teachers and students in other environments, working with engineers and software developers. For I'm committed to the idea, I'm certain about the idea that developing our creative and entrepreneurial qualities is just the most important thing that we can be doing as we face a future filled with so many unknown unknowns. So Mark.
Thank you, Carl. I'm Mark Tully, and I've spent the best part of 4 decades involved in organizations in people-driven industries. I started my career back in my native UK in very junior frontline roles in organizations that are people-driven and rose through the ranks into leadership. So I've got lots of different perspectives about how to help organizations improve effectiveness where the key mission critical activity is what's happening on the front line between an employee and their customer. One of the most influential things that affects that is recruitment, hence why we're here talking to you today. So with that said, we'll crack on. The session objectives today is that we want to give you insights that will help you understand how other industries are using recruitment and what the success factors are aside from qualifications and GPAs and things of this nature. So we're going to be touching on the subject of behavior and how behavior can form a strong foundation, not only for recruitment, but for ongoing professional development. And because we're talking behavior and behavior does relate to the brain, we're just going to bring in a little aspect of neuroscience to give you some context along the way. So that's one of the objectives. And the second one, from those insights, we hope it's an opportunity for you here in North Carolina to then explore, can you apply these tools and in what way you can apply these tools and these thinking in order that you can reimagine how to go about recruiting and screening teacher candidates in the future. Not just the working professionals who are already in the profession perhaps, but how you can use some of these tools to attract and engage with people earlier in their student years. So as a start point, we'd just like to share with you a few trends of what's happening in the recruitment world and things that you might want to consider in the future. First and foremost, like any aspect of business activity and life in general, recruitment has been heavily impacted by technology, both for the employers and how they go about recruiting, but also for the candidates and how they go about identifying vacancies and understanding the kind of roles and the kind of organizations that they may be attracted to. Some of that technology has been good. Some of that technology has not been so good for the recruitment process, which brings me to my second point here. There's been a strong trend to put an emphasis on the candidate experience just in the last few years. There's an awful lot of clutter in the marketplace of job adverts through multiple different kinds of job boards and things of that nature. So how does an organization cut through, try and attract the right kind of caliber of talent to their organization is all about this thing we call candidate experience. And we'll give you some examples of that as we go forward. The third point, which is an ongoing challenge for all organizations, is how can we improve diversity? So that enables, or that requires, looking for fairer recruitment practices, but also the analytics that go around those recruitment practices to make fairer decisions that enables organizations to cultivate more diversity within their workforces. And pre-boarding and onboarding, again, links back partly to this kind of candidate experience. Pre-boarding is how are you engaging with, communicating and building a relationship with an individual who has been hired but has not yet joined the organization. And then once they've joined, how are they being onboarded that creates an emotional connection between them and the organization? and in order that sets them up for success at a very early stage in their career in that organization. And the last trend, and it's the significant one we're going to be talking about today, is the increasing use and application of assessments within the recruitment process. Depending on which surveys you look at, in corporate America, between 42 and 50% of organizations are now using assessments on a routine basis in the recruitment process. But perhaps what's more interesting is that in more recent years, the number of companies who are planning to use assessments in the future is that much greater. So it's a fundamental part of the recruitment process because it supports things such as fairer recruitment practices, it supports the analytical aspect to support decision making, and it also enhances the candidate experience. And we're going to share some of those insights with you. So for context, here's a little bit of a case study just to start with. I want you to imagine that you are the principal of a school. You have interviewed these three candidates. They are existing teachers, perhaps from out of state. You've interviewed them for the same job, and you need to make a hiring decision. They each have a very similar resume in terms of their experiences. Their references are first class. They've performed well in the interview. Which of the three do you choose? Well, let me make that easy for you, and let's think about what their GPAs are. Well, actually, there's no difference when it comes to the GPA. So how do you now choose one of these three candidates? Before we do anything else, perhaps there's going to be a little bit of unconscious bias that builds in here because perhaps you're attracted to one particular candidate more than another. And that's something to do with the brain, and we associate more and are more comfortable with people like ourselves. So without any other tool, perhaps some sort of a bias, whether you realize it or not, may be creeping into the decision-making process. Let me make this a little bit easier. Maybe in a more of a real life situation, there's going to be a variation between GPA scores of different candidates. Now, which candidate would you choose? You're likely to consider, all things considered, for the lady on the right-hand side because she has the highest GPA. But what about if we were to tell you that the lady in the middle with the lowest GPA, due to another insight that we introduce, we have the insight that she would be a higher performing teacher potentially? Then there's something else at play other than qualifications and GPAs. And that's something else that we're talking about here is behavior. And the strength of using behavior and the significance of using behavior in the recruitment process is underlined through this piece of research that we're sharing with you here from Michigan State University. The first three factors that you see here from the top are the ones most commonly used by organizations, and they're most commonly used because they're very tangible. The interview and the resume, they're tangible, and they're also very conventional. Background checks and referencing is becoming more prevalent, and skills and abilities testing, which is different from assessment. And those three factors that you see there are actually less than 50% of success probability. But the second set of factors that you see here in overall terms are behavioral. And these factors in combination is another 50%. Now, it's been difficult in the past to kind of measure and bring these sorts of things such as suitability benchmarking, understanding work aptitudes, understanding the match of the individual to the work environment, which is a huge factor for future success of an individual. These have been difficult to do. But thanks to scientific breakthroughs, we now have the kind of assessment tools that enable organizations to use these sorts of data points to strengthen the recruitment process. So this all relates to behavior. So I'm just going to spend a couple of moments relating this to neuroscience because all behavior is brain-based. Now, we all have a set of certain behavior preferences, our likes and our dislikes, our strengths and our weaknesses. They are part inherited, and they're partly developed through our lifetime experiences that create who we are today. If I talk about this in simple terms, think about a set of behavior preferences as the way of an individual's brain being wired. And when an individual's behavior preferences match the behavioral needs of the job, there's a whole host of advantages and benefits to the institution and to the individual employee. Now, what's interesting here is nothing that you see on this slide relates to GPA. Nothing that you see here relates to academic performance. But when you start bringing behavior as a component into the recruitment process, we are able to predict with greater certainty if somebody fits a role. And if they fit the role in the right way, then all these sorts of benefits start to happen. And why? Well, it's not the individual who fits the role. It's the individual's brain that fits the role. Hence why the focus here is on behavior and behavior development. And I'd like to point out the very last point here about creative capacity. When an individual and their behavior preferences are aligned with the needs of the job, their brain is actually working in its natural state. It's not seeking to change to the outside forces. And in that, when that happens, then the potential for an individual to be flexible, to be adaptable, and therefore to be creative in what they do and what they bring to the work is that much greater. However, if an individual does not behaviorally match a role, what's actually happening? The brain is literally having to work harder. And the more harder the brain works, the less it has the capacity to do other value-adding things, such as bringing creativity into a role. So does this dynamic of behavior, does it make sense? Does it work? We just wanted to share with you examples from 4 case studies that we've been involved in with the product that we help organizations to use from a recruitment point of view. It's called Prism. And this all starts by creating a benchmark for the job. Once that benchmark has been created, using that then to screen candidates, and then using that data with individual candidates right the way through the recruitment process. Now, the bottom row, and these are taken randomly from 4 different sectors that we've worked in. The right-hand sector is a project in the United Kingdom. Public sector is actually the National Health Service, just to give you an insight. So the really interesting piece of data most people would lock into is this bottom row that shows the percentage of individuals hired this way who are behaviorally matched to a job, who are defined by the employer as being a strong performer after year 1. And this is pretty impressive stuff. And in general terms, for these 4 case studies, a success prediction was made 84% of the time. That's a really good factor. But there's some other really interesting data here that supports other advantages of using an assessment tool. So as an example, let me use financial services here. The ratio of screened candidates matched to the success profile, 32%. What that means is that 68% of those who applied for the job do not behaviorally match it. So by bringing in a screening mechanism in the early stage of the recruitment, an organization is saving an awful lot of time. Why interview 10 people for a role when 3 out of 10 of the candidates actually match the role? So immediately you can start to fine tune and create a meaningful shortlist of quality candidates. That's data point number 1 that has an advantage from a time point of view. A second data point that has an advantage from a time point of view, and speed is really important now for the hiring organization, but speed in the age that we live in is also important for the candidate point of view. So the second data point, and I'm just going to use financial services again, candidates matched and employed from the interview, 76%. What does that mean? That means between 7 and 8 out of 10 candidates interviewed were actually hired. The national average in the United States today, that ratio isn't 7 to 10, that ratio is 1 to 10. So in other words, organizations, when they're not using this kind of tool, are having on average to interview 10 people to establish and find 1 candidate. So think about the time implications and the cost implications. I'm just drawing the attention that it's not just about recruitment accuracy, the finding the right people, but it's also the logistics, the time, the cost benefits for the organization and the associated benefits potentially for the candidates as well. So moving on, but staying in the theme of recruitment, we thought it would be interesting to explore an angle of this with you. This is a direct copy and paste of a job that we found on Indeed.com last week that's advertising the role of a high school teaching post here in Raleigh. The skills, duties, and responsibilities is a direct copy and paste, and we've just added in some substance about the job description. The words and the phrases that you see highlighted here, what we're bringing to your attention is, these are all behavioral. And it reinforces this point about why behavior is so important. It's laid out here in an advert. It would be laid out perhaps in a job description. But these are things that it's not so easy to find out from an individual. I've just highlighted here in green a handful of these, which are pretty difficult to really establish in a conventional interview situation. They create ambiguous questions, and ambiguous questions create ambiguous answers. So without the insights of who the person is behaviorally, it's difficult to really land on with accuracy. Does somebody possess these kind of behavioral traits that are necessary to be a high performer? Again, The assessment tool can bring validation. It can bring reassurance to the hiring institution that an individual does possess the right kind of behaviors. And we're less reliant on what goes on in the interview to help us to make better quality recruitment decisions. And I think the last thing I'm going to visit here is give you just a bit more context about this thing called behavior. This is quite a crude model, I have to say. It's just for demonstration purposes today on this presentation. It's quite high level. And you see here some descriptives of different components of behavior. When we undertake benchmarking with organizations, there's a real benefit to that because it creates an insight into a job role from 3 different perspectives. What are the behaviors that are really critical for high performance in that job? What are the behaviors that's unimportant whether somebody has them and doesn't? But critically, what are the behaviors that are potentially counterproductive to being a high performer in that particular role? If we think about teachers just for a moment, which of these, I'm going to call them 4 quadrants, which of these 4 quadrants would you associate more and say that looks to be really important and accurate for a teacher? Which of these do you think is perhaps counterproductive? And the point we're trying to make here is that in actual fact, we are a blend of a number of different behaviors. This is not a labeling exercise. You're never going to recruit somebody who's just a blue. We all have components of these behaviors, but in different combinations. And it's the right combination of those behaviors of an individual to the right combination of the needs of the job where you're really trying to find a really, really good match. So an example here, to me, it's pretty obvious that the blue quadrant here possesses a lot of the behavioral traits that's necessary for somebody to be motivated, energetic, and persevere and all that kind of good stuff in a teaching role. Another quick insight, it's not just about the obvious things. Look at the second line of the blue quadrant, handles repetitive or routine work well. That's environmental, which is also a really important point. Repetitive is not literal, that it's the identical job day in, day out. But think about a teaching role. It does have that high level of routine to it, that the individual is in the same classroom, perhaps, teaching the same students, teaching around more or less the same subject matter on a daily basis. So you need to be hiring people who value that, who thrive in that environment. And for somebody who finds that stifling, clearly that's an indication that it's counterproductive for them and for the role. And therefore the outcomes at the moment of truth, when the teaching is taking place with students, the outcome is not as impactful and not to the quality that it could be. So just another insight into this thing called behavior. And with that said, I'm just going to hand over and segue in a little bit to Carl, who's going to build on this point about behaviors.
So a brief section here, folks, on a point that we believe at Being Better Than Before is just very, very important. And that is that we begin to embrace teaching as a creative profession. So for you see that every one of those highlighted behaviors that Mark shared with you on those previous 2 slides, whether it was the behaviors in the job description slide, or the behaviors identified by the 4 quadrants, every one of those behaviors will be incrementally more productive, more generative, more innovative and collaborative, certainly more useful when accomplished by folks who are more creative in their thinking and entrepreneurial in their behaviors. And when that happens, you can create 100 victories with students every week. And so if we're going to talk to you about the importance of being creative, perhaps you'd expect that we're going to define creativity for you. No, we really won't, because the idea of being creative and entrepreneurial is way too big for a definition. So instead, we're going to describe some aspects of it and urge you to pick and choose those that really work for you as a creative person. Certainly, it's seeing problems as opportunities. I think we would all agree that a creative person has the capacity for that. It's looking at what others have been looking at and seeing what others haven't seen, because that happens when you intentionally overcome the status quo impact that is always directing you to see and think the way you always have. And it's certainly doing what you can with what you have where you are. That's a wonderful creative dynamic. So it's being flexible and resilient and being ready to adapt. It's being generous with new ideas. That's a big part of my creative teaching, is to help people be generous with new ideas so they can learn from those ideas. Being generous is being generative is part of our proposition. It's designing, it's improving. This list is not complete, folks. It's just to prompt you in your thinking about what it means to be creative. It's teaching, it's discovering, it's learning and imagining. Being creative is initiating and orchestrating, it's empathizing, experimenting, organizing, and cultivating, all qualities of a creative mind, not necessarily suggesting that we need to have all of these ourselves, but rather each and every one of us has got many of these in our work. So teaching as a creative profession is a wonderful position to take, because teachers will not only accomplish these core tasks more efficiently, they will be better prepared to nurture the creative qualities of their students, which is vitally important today. And there's two major reasons why this is vitally important today. This is not the last major disruption that these students are going to face in their lives. And they're going to face so many all throughout their lives, face a future of so many unknown unknowns. And they will be more capable of creating advantage for themselves, of creating advantage for their families and their communities, for their organizations, when they approach these unknowns with a more creative and entrepreneurial approach. And businesses are increasingly placing a premium value on being creative. So if we're nurturing students for their best futures, well, all those employers out there are looking for creative and entrepreneurial students. An IBM survey of 1,500 CEOs said the #1 skill set that employers are looking for is creativity. LinkedIn's last 3 annual surveys of business leaders has indicated that being creative and entrepreneurial is the employee skill set most valued. And it's important to make the point that these calls for more creative and entrepreneurial qualities are throughout the whole organization, not just in marketing, not just in product development, but all throughout the organization and in all business functions. So what does this suggest? It suggests to us that recruiting teachers to be creative in their work and aligning their tasks with their preferred behaviors to nurture their creative qualities. And let me be clear here for a moment that once you understand your preferred behaviors, you will begin to understand that every cluster, every quadrant of preferred behaviors is loaded with creative and entrepreneurial qualities. The work that I've done with Mark in understanding how Prism gives us insights into our behaviors has helped me understand how there are creative qualities found in each and every one of those quadrants, each and every one of those clusters of preferred behaviors. And when you cultivate the creative qualities within those behaviors, it will result in teachers being much more capable of developing the creative qualities of their students. And that will position teaching as a creative profession, which will assist in the recruiting effort as the profession is elevated through its embrace of the fact that it is such a wonderfully creative profession.
So, do all teachers require the same mix of behavioral preferences? As a way to explore that, what you see on the screen here is an example of 4 teaching roles that have been pulled off the O.NET, the US Department of Labor O.NET jobs database. That jobs database doesn't do the graphical comparison, just to fill in a bit of a gap here. This is the way we present this information to students. You can ignore the red line because that would be the behavior preferences of a student. The green line is the important one for our discussion today. The green is the benchmark of the profile and mix of behaviors to be a high performer in each of these teaching roles. So for the student, this is used to give them that graphical comparison of the extent to which they would fit a role in order to help them make more accurate career planning decisions, just to give you some insight there. But what does this mean in our conversation today? There is a difference between different teaching roles. I've purposely taken from O.NET 4 very different roles you can see here. And the green line does suggest that there are quite some differences. An example being the athletics teaching coach in the bottom left versus the chemistry teaching post in the top left. What I would say though, from the 61 different teaching roles that are profiled through O.NET, one common denominator is this blue behavior that I talked about earlier. So in essence, there is a core commonality with a lot of teaching roles of certain behaviors, but then there is a a deviation dependent on the teaching needs, the subject matter, and the way that different subject matters need to be taught. So there isn't a kind of one size fits all by any means. And these are generic from O.NET by its definition. These are national profiles that are created, so they don't go down to a region level, a district level, even an individual school level, which is something that we can do. And I'm going to explain that actually in the next slide. I mentioned under recruitment trends at the early part of the presentation that one trend in the private sector is organizations seeking to bring a more factual and analytical approach to both the recruitment process and also the decision-making process in order to make more accurate recruitment decisions. So I'd like to just walk you through a number of key steps so you can envisage how an assessment tool can be used, and certainly the assessment tool that we deploy. The first part of that is creating these benchmarks. So we're not relying on using national or generic benchmarks like I showed you in an earlier slide from O.NET. These can be very granular, creating benchmarks for individual teaching posts by district perhaps, or by school, or by subject. The tool that we have is numbers based. It's an analytical tool, and that means it has a great deal of sensitivity to it. So we can pick up the behavioral nuances between these different teaching posts. And once the benchmark is created, that then can be used first and foremost to screen candidates against. And because it's analytically based, this is a screen grab of a best fit report. Imagine if 50 candidates are being considered for one teaching post and the 50 are screened using the tool that we have, then we present that information back, best fit, with the names of the individuals codified. And that's really powerful, because that means when you're making a decision about how many candidates to move forward in the recruitment process, you don't know their name, which means you don't know their gender, their age, their ethnicity, you don't know their GPAs. Once we've gone through that part of the process and you're at the interview stage, the same data that has been captured by these candidates, we can then create very granular interview guides. These have an advantage that it creates a common way of interviewing by different individuals and across different institutions. And they're also behavior-based. They're mapped and designed in a way that the interviewer is using very specific behavioral-based questions. And that's another part of fair recruitment practices in order to seek out and recruit people from a diversity point of view. And then lastly, the data doesn't stop there. Using that data, creating onboarding reports, creating very simple, granular, customized coaching reports, as an example that a principal can use as the principal greets a new hire into the building on day one, or even prior to day one as a pre-boarding exercise. All these things are easily available to be done. And just highlighting here once again that a number of these key steps does support a non-biased approach to recruitment in order to cultivate a more diverse workforce. So where do all these pieces of an assessment tool fit if we consider the primary gateways? Well, first, if we consider the interest and exposure stages here, then really the assessment tool and benchmarks can be used to create conversations and create conversations early. So it's possible to have conversations with students in high school or in college to start attracting them perhaps into the profession, stimulating interest by demonstrating the match of the individual students to the teaching role, but also showing them how they're matched to teaching as a creative profession. Then as individuals prepare through EPP, then these benchmarks and the individual's own profile can be used of the students to match them to the EPP as part of an attraction and a recruitment process. And then when it comes to employment, the student as a candidate at that stage is able to articulate the value that they bring in that teaching post, the value that they bring to that individual institution by articulating both their suitability, their qualifications, their GPAs, etc., but also their eligibility in how they see themselves and how they can explain how they match the role that's going to make them a wonderful teacher for a long-term career. I've already touched on this once, so I won't do it much more here, but we can assess and learn about the factors that drive performance. The benchmarking process is quite open-ended when we do this with organizations, that we look at and we test different models of understanding and identifying the absolutely most important behaviors. So these are examples of the ways that we can do this. We can do this based on, is it a junior school, a middle school, or a high school? We can do it based on the subjects. We can create profiles based on the school district. We can create profiles understanding characteristics where the student characteristic is an important consideration. And we can create profiles not just for teaching posts, for department heads, for principals in leadership positions. Profiles can be created and not used just from a recruitment process, but can be used for talent management and professional development on an ongoing basis. So in conclusion, there's a number of key learning points that we can take from the private sector. First and foremost is adopting a modern set of recruitment practices and using modern tools will without doubt improve diversity. Just in this last one or two slides, I've demonstrated that there's a number of ways to bring a blind decision-making into the process, but blind decisions that are rational because they're data-based in the data that you have to support those decisions. We've established that people who behaviorally match the job role will deliver. In the private sector, we call it better business outcomes. In education, what is it about? It's about better student outcomes. So those teachers who are behaviorally matched to the job role are naturally motivated. They don't think about teaching in a certain way. They don't think about putting a student at the center of their thinking, but it's part of their behavioral DNA that they do it. Teaching is a creative profession. That means it's personally rewarding to the individuals who are allowed to express themselves and bring creativity into their teaching. But it also means by positioning teaching as a creative profession, it enhances the esteem of that profession with other professions. That's important if we consider seeking to attract people from the workforce, perhaps who've left the teaching profession and attract them back in as they see the attraction towards done by through a more appealing perception and reputation of the teaching as a profession. People who behaviorally match the role will be better placed to embrace the changing demands. Let me give you a small example of this. Think back to the early stages of COVID, when teachers were overnight transformed from teaching in a conventional classroom setting to having to get used to the virtual teaching, used to Zoom, used to new tools, perhaps seeking and forced to find new learning content and ways to engage with their students in a virtual context. Those teachers perhaps who burnt the midnight oil and worked through the weekend, who did that, that's an example of being behaviorally matched. They don't have to think about doing it. They want a better outcome for their students, irrespective of the situation. Identifying the differences in teaching demands between different districts, perhaps different schools, and different characteristics of students, that can create very, very targeted recruitment that you may be looking for a different kind of teacher, a slightly different set of behaviors for one situation versus another. And that creates very focused, targeted recruitment. And we're showing here that the use of an assessment tool can actually be used to start the career conversations early, perhaps at high school age, perhaps in college, perhaps targeting those diverse groups to build relationships, to demonstrate to people in very tangible ways, not just asking the question, have you considered teaching? But it's a different conversation to say, do you realize that you have a really great behavioral match to be a high performer in this teaching post? That's a really powerful conversation to have to attract and recruit people in the education stage of their studying. So that's it from Carl and I. We hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and it's brought some meaningful insights that you can use. And here's our contact details if you'd like to be in touch. Thank you.